Hi, this is Mike Billington. I'm with the Executive Intelligence Review, EIR, and the Schiller Institute. I'm speaking with Colonel Richard Black, a Army and Marine veteran who also served as head of the U.S. Army's Criminal Law Division at the Pentagon. He then also served in the Virginia legislature, first as a representative in the House of Delegates and then as a state senator. So, Colonel Black, you are, I know, aware of the Ukrainian drone attacks on the Amavir nuclear early warning radar, approximately 180 kilometers from Ukraine, and a second unsuccessful attack, which occurred yesterday on the same site, as well as another attack on the Orsk nuclear early warning radar, which is 1,800 kilometers, a long way from Ukraine on the Kazakhstan border. The knowledgeable military and intelligence analysts like yourself have warned as forcefully as they can that this directly challenges the clearly stated nuclear doctrine of the Russians that the use of their nuclear weapons would potentially be activated by, and this is a quote, any attack by an adversary against critical government or military sites of the Russian Federation, disruption of which would undermine nuclear forces' response actions. Of course, this is exactly what Ukraine has just done. So what is your analysis of the level of danger that the world faces as a result?
Yeah, thank you for having me on today, Mike. I'd just like to add, because I'm always sensitive to the impression that someone might get that I'm perhaps not entirely patriotic about our country and our service members. I fought with the 1st Marine Division. First I flew 269 combat missions by helicopter, and then fought in some of the most fierce battle, actually the bloodiest battle of the whole Vietnam War for the Marine Corps. And this was on the ground as a forward air controller. And my last battle, both of my radio men were killed right beside me. I was wounded, and I went on. I was a Marine officer, Marine company commander later on, and then went back to school, on to law school, became an Army JAG officer. I ended up spending several years in Germany at Kaiserslautern, where I interfaced very heavily with the German authorities, and we were prepared, and I was personally prepared to die fighting in the defense of Germany during the Cold War, during a very, very tense period. So I don't hesitate to sacrifice or to risk my life, and I've done it literally on hundreds of occasions now. So with that, let me just shift in now. So we've had 3 of these drone attacks deep into Russia, and it is very likely that the United States was involved, that we provided precise information to assist the Ukrainians, assuming that they had a role at all. But certainly there were these drone attacks, one of them apparently very, very damaging to the Russian early warning system. Apparently, from what I understand, the Russians do not have the type of satellite early warning system that we have. They may have some satellite technology that's helpful, but for the most part, their nuclear early warning system is an over the horizon or up to the horizon type of intercept, to where They have somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes notice. If the West fires a massive array of nuclear weapons aimed at Russia, there is a very, very brief time during which they can respond. Now, they have a very well-defined nuclear doctrine. Russia's nuclear doctrine is exclusively defensive, and it provides 4 scenarios under which nuclear weapons can be used. One, of course, is if Russia is simply attacked by nuclear missiles. Another is if nuclear missiles are launched at them. Another one is if the Russian state is threatened by superior weapons, conventional or otherwise, that actually is an existential threat to the cohesion of the Russian nation. Now, the most important, however, is that Russia is, under their doctrine, able to use nuclear weapons if they believe that nuclear missiles are being launched against it. In other words, if an attack is aimed at crippling its nuclear forces, I'm sorry. They do have the one if they believe there are missiles being launched, but beyond that, Russia believes that there is an attack aimed at crippling its nuclear forces, they can respond. Now, if you look at where we are right now with the 3 drone attacks directed at their eyes and ears against nuclear attacks, this clearly would trigger the nuclear doctrine of Russia. Now, in addition to, there's actually a cohesive movement towards a preparation for nuclear war. I'm not saying that we have made some sort of a decision, but we certainly are laying all the groundwork in case a decision was made. We're attacking their early warning systems by blinding them. We are
Okay, so we had a disruption in the recording, but we're back, and Colonel Black will continue with his presentation. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So in any event, we have the drone attacks. We have significant drone attacks against the Engels nuclear bomber base in Russia, deep within Russia. And additionally, we are on the verge of sending F-16 jets, which are nuclear capable, and sending them into Ukraine. All of these come together, and keep in mind that from the Russian perspective, if you put yourself in their shoes, what do they see? They see that Russia is being blinded to where it can't detect incoming attacks. Its nuclear bomber fleet is being attacked and is being repeatedly attacked. Now we see NATO moving nuclear-capable F-16 jets into the country. You put all this together, and it's a very nerve-wracking situation for Russia, where they have such a short period between a nuclear launch and a decision being made. What do they do? How do they respond? One of the most dangerous things about the entire Ukrainian project is that when the Cold War ended in 1991, and the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union dissolved, the Warsaw Pact dissolved. At that point, there was a 1,000-mile buffer between East and West, a tremendous distance to where it made it very difficult for Russia to launch a surprise attack or the United States. And this was a historic opportunity for both the West and the East to have protection against a surprise attack, and the ability to pick up the phone, and we did create red lines, hot lines where President of the United States could call the president in Russia and say, we're seeing something unusual, what's going on? They could hash it out very quickly. This has been eroded very deliberately by NATO. And they have moved the borders of NATO further and further east until finally they were to the point where sort of the last brick in the wall was Ukraine. Ukraine's a very large country, and even Ukraine itself provided a significant buffer between East and West. In 2008, there were discussions in which President Bush decided that it would be good if we moved further, and if we allowed Ukraine, perhaps, to become a member of NATO. This, of course, would mean that there would be the potential for nuclear weapons to be stationed immediately on the Russian border. Now, if you put them there, you're talking about just a few minutes, 5 minutes before Moscow is struck by nuclear weapons. So it was clearly an existential threat. There is a reason behind why President Putin, with tremendous reluctance, ordered his troops to cross the Russian border. And predominant in that was this idea that by eliminating the border, it would make Russia a nuclear target. So this was a tremendous problem. This is not to say that the White House has made the decision that we're going to do something. But what you see is the Pentagon leaning forward, putting in place all of the mechanisms for a US-led NATO attack on Russia if the command authority made a decision that that was an appropriate thing to do. This is a very dangerous thing to do. It raises the possibility that there could be an accident. Someone could misinterpret aircraft coming in a strangely provocative method, some tremendous number of missiles that couldn't be identified. There are any number of scenarios, and we're reaching the point where the time in which to react is so limited that Russia is almost forced to put into place procedures. You would like to think that there was a central organizing intellect to the decision-making, whether we were going to launch a global nuclear war that potentially could kill 60% of the human population of the Earth. But the United States and NATO have deliberately made this decision to eliminate this buffer zone and to create this terrible level of uncertainty by moving all the way to the Russian border. So that's where we stand right now, and hopefully no one will make a mistake. We're in a very tenuous situation.
As you know, the Schiller Institute has gathered and circulated a red alert on this question with statements from yourself and a number of other military and intelligence professionals. And unfortunately, since there's virtually no press coverage or almost none, there was somewhat of a break in the Washington Post this morning. But what do you think of what we're doing with this alert? And what else would you suggest must be done if we're going to intervene to stop this horror from unfolding?
I think that the Schiller alert is excellent. All that we can really do is to preemptively lay out for the public the fact that there are all of these pieces in place to where the Russians can very easily perceive that we are on the verge of carrying out a surprise nuclear attack. And it's very interesting. While the Russian nuclear doctrine is exclusively defensive and designed simply to ward off a nuclear attack from the West, that's not the case with the United States. The United States nuclear doctrine allows the United States U.S. reserves the right to launch a nuclear first strike. This is essentially the Pearl Harbor option, where the President of the United States, who has the sole authority to launch a nuclear attack, he can simply decide that he thinks that conditions are right, that the U.S. could benefit, and he can order a nuclear strike, a first strike, without first having the Russians take any sort of aggressive action. So we have a very dangerous nuclear doctrine, one that does not provide any sort of bumpers or curbs to limit the authority of the president. And of course, the Russians are keenly aware of that nuclear doctrine, just as we are aware of theirs. And so that makes the situation even more dicey. We had the situation where back early on in the war, Senator Roger Wiker, Republican of Mississippi, second highest Republican on the Senate Armed Services Committee, made the statement that we do not rule out the first use of nuclear action. Now, what he was saying was technically accurate, but for him to come out and say it, he was saying it in conjunction with some other things that we might do to, to react to Russia entering the war in Ukraine. And for him to come out and just to say we don't rule out the first use nuclear action, I think was terribly dangerous to the cause of world peace and to avoiding the potential for a nuclear conflagration. So it's an option that is always on the table, and the Russians cannot ignore it.
In a 1-hour interview with me 2 years ago, which happened just soon after the Russia launched their special military operation into Ukraine, that interview received over 1 million views. It was literally went viral around the world in many languages, with hundreds and hundreds of comments. You warned at that time that the war could lead to a global conflict, even a nuclear war, if it wasn't resolved by a peace negotiation at the beginning. So what happened to prevent such a peace negotiation?
There were negotiations underway between Ukraine and Russia. These negotiations were proceeding so productively because Russia didn't want this war. People don't understand. Russia did not want to go to war. They did not want to cross the border with Ukraine. But things had reached such an extent that it appeared as though Ukrainian forces were on the verge of attacking the Donbass. The United States had built up a very powerful military force with which to attack the two breakaway republics. And those republics, Donetsk and Luhansk, had very, very modest military forces, and they would have very quickly been overwhelmed. And Russia they had previously put on the table to NATO a very explicit peace proposal to ward off. They went to desperate measures to avert a war breaking out, and NATO just sort of blew it off. I think the decision had clearly been made that NATO would provoke the war. They would, if it took having Ukraine attack the Donbass republics, they were just on the verge of doing it, and so President Putin very reluctantly ordered the Russian army to move forward. Now, people don't realize that the Russian army, now this is the army of the Russian Federation, not the old Soviet army, which was huge and aggressive, but the army of the Federation, of the Russian Federation, was essentially a home force. They were not an expeditionary force that projected power across the globe. They did not have major experience fighting really large wars. The biggest was their intervention with great reluctance into Syria, where they essentially had air power operating in support of the Syrian army. But very, very little ground warfare. They had fought in Georgia, they had fought in Transnistria, which is part of Moldova. And those were tiny wars. They're like 900 people killed on all sides, including civilians who got crosswise. This was more of a clash than an actual war in Georgia and in Moldova. So when President Putin ordered his attack, I think it was with the realization that either he did it now and knocked off stride the Ukrainians that were about to attack the Donbass, or perhaps face the fact that the Ukraine army would roll literally to the borders of Russia, at which point the Russian people would demand that either he do something or they put in place somebody who would. So people don't realize that we provoked the war in Ukraine, and this was a decision that was made by President Obama during his administration, and in 2014, he gave the green light for the Central Intelligence Agency and the State Department to assist in overthrowing the legitimate, duly elected government of Ukraine. and we carried out a coup, which successfully removed the elected president of Ukraine. And we literally chose the cabinet ministers for the revolutionary junta that took place. And then we worked with them to where they did things that were so provocative that it caused some of the areas, Crimea and the two Donbass republics, to break away. And we essentially forced Russia to cross the border and begin the war. So they were not ready at all at the time. And the Russian army was not structured for fighting overseas ventures or out of the country ventures. And that's why initially the war did not proceed as they had hoped, as the Russians had hoped. But they have changed, and they're now fully mobilized and ready to move forward. So that is where we have come to be, and I think what you see is NATO and the United States, as part of NATO, making this decision that we will up the ante, we will escalate, we will take more and more perilous actions and take this thing right up to the edge of World War III.
Even though now it's generally recognized, widely recognized, that the war has essentially been lost in Ukraine, at least on the ground, and that the danger is that, as you just indicated, the US and NATO may decide to escalate to full-scale open direct war with Russia, even nuclear war, rather than to admit defeat on the ground. Your view?
Yes, General Syrskyi, the top commander of the Ukrainian forces, has said that subsequent to President Putin's re-election, which went extremely well for him, that the Russian forces have become significantly more active. They have ramped up their offensive, and while we don't know for a fact that the major Russian summer offensive has begun, it is clear that there is a great deal of activity on the border. And the problem that Ukraine has is that they have simply run out of manpower. They're trying to mobilize some younger people, but they're not having very good success getting those people mobilized and to the front. And there's tremendous resistance. People, literally, the streets of major cities in Ukraine have emptied out since they issued the new mobilization orders. People don't want to go outside. They don't want to be rounded up by the authorities. People are not anxious to fight anymore because everyone who goes forward to the front ends up being killed or coming back an amputee. So what's happening is the ground has become dry, and the drier it becomes, particularly as you edge into the summer, the easier it is to move heavy weapons forward and to bring in fuel trucks, to have tanks, to have bridging equipment. All these major heavy pieces of equipment are now able to travel, and to travel rapidly. And we know that the Russians have an enormous amount of armor, artillery, mobile artillery. All of their factories are online, churning out weapons much faster than NATO or the United States is capable of doing. And we're seeing activity like I reported several weeks ago on a very strange anomaly on the war maps, where in the direction of a town named Ochertinye, instead of seeing the normal little bump out that you do where the Russians would move forward, you saw a line, an arrow that just stabbed several miles deep into Ukrainian territory. And when I saw it, I thought, that's very unusual. It's extremely aggressive, and it's very perilous for a force to move forward like that, like the Russians did, because you literally could have a platoon of Ukrainians who would move in and block the road and isolate that force long enough for reinforcements to annihilate it. So I watched it over the next few days, and what happened is that initial stab, that arrow line that went several miles deep, began to widen and widen, and they opened the shoulders, and they brought in additional forces to defend the flanks. And then they moved into Ochertinye, which was a significant defensive position, which should have taken a great deal of effort to capture. They captured it in rather short order, and then from there they branched out and they began attacking in different directions. And that has become a major bulge in the Ukrainian lines. It's not clear that the Ukrainians have managed to bring that bulge under control. They may still do it, but they haven't accomplished it yet. And then the next thing that happens, as they're struggling to bring reinforcements in to shore up that bulge, the Russian army made a major attack against the second largest Ukrainian city, Kharkiv. Now, Kharkiv is an odd position because it's located just a short distance from the Russian border, and yet it is the second largest Ukrainian city. And all of a sudden, Russia crossed the border. The defenses were inadequate. There weren't enough people to defend the land leading up to Kharkiv, and the Russians moved out and captured as much territory within days as the entire Ukrainian counteroffensive, this highly touted spring counteroffensive, had captured in its entirety. And they did it with very few casualties. And that forced the Ukrainians to move troops forward. So what's happening is you have this strain all across this 1,000-kilometer border, and they don't have the people to plug it. And I think the idea is sinking into NATO and certain elements in the White House and the Pentagon, State Department, that Ukraine is losing the war, and that there's probably nothing we can do that will change that, unless we do something extremely reckless and we literally go to war with Russia directly, so that all of NATO will proceed to go to war. That decision hasn't been made, but we see them inching further and further. The French have now put elements of the Foreign Legion. You can occasionally see photographs of a dead Frenchman wearing the patch of France on his shoulder. So we're becoming more reckless, more aggressive, and it's just a question of whether we will reach a point where we say, look, this is inevitable. We don't want to risk a nuclear war. whether we go beyond that point.
In an interview you did with our friend Jim Jatras, you compared the Ukraine-Russia conflict to the Civil War in the United States. Do you want to expand on that idea?
Sure. When the Civil War broke out, the Confederate States of America had a military tradition. They weren't an urban population. They were an agrarian population. So you had people who were they were pioneers who they built their own homes in the wilderness, and they defended against marauders with their own guns. And the husband, the wife would defend against attacks at the windows. So they were very militaristic in nature. And the Union Army had a very large contingent of Southern officers and enlisted men who were part of the United States Army. Robert E. Lee was the top graduate of West Point, a brilliant officer, and Abraham Lincoln offered Robert E. Lee command of the Union forces, and Robert E. Lee declined respectfully because while he had loyalty to the United States, his principal loyalty was to his state, as was the case with most everyone at that time. So you had this Southern Army organized, well prepared, and you had a larger force, a Union force that came down out of Washington, D.C. and moved to Manassas, to a place later called Bull Run. And the North was so confident that they were going to succeed that ladies came out in carriages, with their parasols, and they wanted to see this great slaughter of the Southern forces. And before the day was over, they were fleeing in panic as the Southern forces surged forward. So the South was very, very valiant, very organized militarily. It's similar with what we've seen in the very early days of the war in Ukraine, where the Russians came forward. They expected Ukraine to fold quickly. Ukraine didn't. They had a very fine military tradition of their own, aside from the Russian tradition, and they fought very valiantly. So then what you had is gradually the two sides sparred, but just like the Union in the Civil War, the Union had the industry, it had the arms industries, it had the population. Its population was roughly comparable to the difference between that of Russia and Ukraine. So just as now Ukraine had some weapons factories, considerable number, but most of those have been captured by the Russians already. And so the big industrial base is in Russia, not in Ukraine. That was the same in the Civil War. Yes, in the South, they did have weapons, and weapons production, but predominantly it was in the North. And eventually they fought year after year, and finally the South was bled dry. And for that reason, Robert E. Lee rode in and surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Now, it wasn't because the South hadn't fought. In fact, the South killed considerably more Union troops than the Union killed of Southern troops. But the South just did not have the people to replace them. And that's where we stand right now. And the Union, of course, the Union became more proficient at war. Their generals became better. Their soldiers became more competent as the war went on, and that's happened with Russia. So at this point, I think we're approaching the Appomattox moment where there will need to be a surrender of the Ukrainian forces. Haven't reached that point yet, but I think we have the possibility that perhaps with the Russian offensive in the summer, that may come.
Huh. The other thing you brought up in that interview, which I found striking, was your discussion about the fact that the American top staff, the general staff, the generals, have never really experienced what you call high-intensity warfare. They've only fought against weak and poorly armed third world, mostly, forces. And therefore, when the Western generals planned the Ukrainian offensive last year, they simply weren't capable of dealing with what kind of an opponent they were up against in a major, strong, not only nuclear, but militarily and industrially strong opponent in Russia. And that you saw this as the main reason for the utter failure of the so-called Ukrainian offensive. You want to elaborate on that?
Yes, and not only that, but there's a lack of intuitive feel for what desperate combat is, high-intensity combat. We've gone through such a period. The last time we experienced high-intensity combat was in Vietnam. And I was reviewing some old papers from back in those days, and there's a gentleman who fought with me in Fox Company, 1st Marine Regiment, and he was recounting some of the things that happened. And there's actually there's also a very good book that was written called The Road of 10,000 Pains that talks about the conflict in the Quezon Valley. And there's a scene where there's this tremendous clash between a single Marine company and an entrenched battalion of North Vietnamese, a very elite battalion. Snipers are knocking Marines out one after the other. There were about 120 Marines, 33 were killed, 81 were wounded. So almost everyone was killed or wounded. And we consider it a tremendous tribute to the company that we had, that the North Vietnamese were never able to overrun us, despite the fact that they had a fairly intact battalion. But in the course of that, then you change focus to what's happening within the 1st Marine Division, and someone comes running in and he says there's been a bald eagle declared, mount up, get the men ready. And he says to a sergeant, he says, get the artillery FO here. The sergeant says he's not here, he's out at the division headquarters. The commander says, all right, he says, you're the artillery FO. He says, get your gear and come on. He says, you're going to be the one. And then there's a battalion commander from another battalion. He says, we're alerted for the bald eagle. He says, you get your men to the landing zone in 20 minutes. He says, we don't have any maps. He says, what we're going to do, says we're going to land. We know approximately where Fox Company is, and we're going to fan out. And someone says, well, why are we just fanning out? Why don't we just go where they are? He says, they're missing. And all of a sudden, the people there say, missing? What does he mean missing? We have a marine company that has simply disappeared. Well, this was what was happening, is you had organizations that were just collapsing. You had battalions jumping on, and this one battalion comes in, and the battalion commander, the lieutenant colonel in charge of all the men, next thing a mortar hits, and he's got a piece of steel projecting from his head, and everybody thought, oh, he's dead. And somehow he staggered to his feet, and he continued to lead the offensive. And I can just barely touch on a little bit of this. They run up forward, and they see that they cross over this one little log, and there are just dozens and dozens of Marines dead, wounded, with flies covering their bodies, and you could just smell the death in the air. And this is going on all over the place on a very large scale. This is what is happening in Ukraine right now. And Americans are not organized for it, they're not prepared for it. If you'll notice, and I don't want to get into the women in combat debate, but you will notice that there are essentially no women in combat with the Ukrainians. They have employed them a couple of times, and sadly they disappeared from the battlefield very quickly. So the United States is organized to where we've literally integrated the men and the women, and it's not a tenable situation in high intensity combat. So we're going to have to suddenly reorganize, and we're having trouble recruiting people. We can't get people to join the military now. We are not prepared to fight, and we are led by these woke generals who are more concerned about pronouns and about critical race theory, and how can you divide your men up into oppressed and oppressors. We are a mess. Our military today, we've changed the names of our bases and erased our military ethos, or this mystic quality of, I'm from Fort Bragg. My daddy was there. My grandfather went from Fort Bragg, and he was in D-Day or whatever. We've erased it all. So we are not in a position to fight. And as a consequence, instead of thinking so much in terms of conventional, there is a great risk now that we begin to think in terms of tactical nuclear weapons, perhaps strategic nuclear weapons, something with which we can pull victory from the jaws of defeat. And that helps to make it a very, very dicey situation as this war begins to finally gel between Russia and Ukraine.
Okay, thank you. Let me move to discuss the Middle East a bit. You're somebody who has spent a great deal of time and personal energy and creative thought on issues of the Middle East, especially in Syria. I saw that you recently interviewed the Syrian, I think he was the ambassador to the UN. Was that his position?
Well, I haven't spoken with him recently, but I was actually fairly close friends with Ambassador Jafari of Syria, and so I tracked the Syrian war literally before it began, because the genesis of it was with our attack on Libya, and we attacked Libya. We invaded it. It was an unprovoked attack by France, Britain, and the United States. And the major reason was that we needed weapons with which to overthrow the legitimate government of Syria. And so we utilized Al-Qaeda forces in Benghazi, and we organized them through the CIA, and we had them rise up and basically start a revolution in Benghazi. The central government sent troops to try to bring order because the terrorists were taking postal workers and other civil servants, taking them up on high buildings, and then they would just push them off and push them to their death. And so Colonel Gaddafi, who was very influential in the government of Libya at the time, said, we're going to put an end to this. We're going to restore law and order. We can't have people thrown off of buildings to their death. And he sent forces. And at that point, we used that as a trigger. We said, oh, he's going to be so tough on these people. All they're doing is having a little fun in Benghazi, pushing men and women off buildings. And we went in. First, it was either the British or the French who started bombing, and then we picked up. We did the heavy lifting, and essentially we destroyed the entire country, all of the infrastructure, everything of value, and we captured their arsenal of weapons. They bought a great number from the United States, and we turned over an airfield that had been captured by the terrorists in Benghazi. We turned it over to the Turks, and we flew weapons into Turkey, and under CIA Project Timber Sycamore, which was later declassified, we had a great array of warehouses, and we filled them with these looted weapons from Libya and moved them across the border to supply Al-Qaeda. And ironically, Al-Qaeda they were the force that had crashed the jets into the Twin Towers and the Pentagon just 10 years earlier. And now we were their supporters. And to this day, we have been unwavering supporters of Al-Qaeda. They don't use the name Al-Qaeda in Syria, but there's documents have identified them as Al-Qaeda in Syria. And so we have used the terrorists and used them to try to overthrow the legitimate government. So I followed that for really throughout the war. I was on the battlefront in 2 different places, not under fire, but I landed in Palmyra immediately after a great victory that blunted an enormous ISIS army that came across the desert 100 miles in perfect view of the United States aircraft. And we never dropped a single bomb because we were hoping that ISIS would conquer the Syrian army at Palmyra, and they failed. So I was there, and I was on the front line in Aleppo shortly after Syria won the Great Battle of Aleppo, which was sort of like the Stalingrad of the Syrian war. And I was on the front in a building behind very heavy sandbags, and I peered through the embrasure to look out to the other side. I knew there were snipers, but I also knew that it took them a certain time to sight in and to fire and for the bullet to travel. And after I had looked through the embrasure for a few moments, one of the Syrian generals literally grabbed me and pulled me out of there so that I wouldn't be a target. I think he didn't want President Assad to hear that he had allowed me to be shot by a sniper. But in any event, I've followed that very, very closely. And it has some relevance to what's going on, because for the longest time, of course, ISIS and Al Qaeda drove forward, they drove back the Syrians, and then there was the great victory at Palmyra, and then there was this back and forth, sort of a stalemate, a little bit like we've seen in Ukraine. And then it just reached a point where it stalemated, and then there was sort of a shudder on the lines, on the Al-Qaeda, ISIS lines, and the Syrian army began to break through. And the terrorists began to withdraw and to roll back, and the Syrian army moved faster and faster. And eventually there was a full retreat, and both ISIS and Al-Qaeda would have been utterly annihilated had it not been that President Obama, after swearing on whatever he swears on, it's not the Bible, that there would be no American boots on the ground, he sent in American troops. They worked to outrace the Syrian army and to capture northern Syria, so that we would control the wheat, the breadbasket of Syria, and the oil. And that way we would be able to impose famine conditions on the country and to keep them from having the oil with which to rebuild the nation. And that is the situation we're in today. So
your interview with the Syrian diplomat I saw was in honor of the fact that Syria has now been brought back into the Arab League after having been expelled. And I think it was 11 or 12 years ago, they've been, even though they were one of the founders of the Arab League, they basically were expelled as part of this Western ideological demonization of Assad and Syria. So,
I mentioned that I hadn't seen him for quite a while. That was the new ambassador, and yes, we did do an interview with him, and that was certainly more recent.
And what do you think about the situation now with Syria, and what do you think the Arab states can do to try to intervene on this slaughter in Palestine?
Let me talk about the situation in Palestine with the other Arab countries. We have kind of a tenuous situation emerging there, and I don't know what will happen. But Egypt has had one or more of its soldiers killed on the border. Now, under the Camp David Accords from long ago that were very successful, they ended the 1973 war, and Egypt was given control of the border of the Gaza Strip, and they allow certain produce to cross the border so that people can eat. There are 2.4 million people, and the Israelis maintain a total naval and land blockade of the Gaza Strip, so that all of the food, all of the building materials, anything that they need comes out of Egypt. Well, Israel has now captured that area, so that presumably there will be a total blockade of everything if Israel has its way, and I suppose people will just simply perish over time. Now, there's a great deal of tension in Egypt, and I understand the Egyptians are sort of coming to grips with the fact that war may be forced on them. They don't want it, but it may just simply be forced on them. And Turkey, meanwhile, President Erdogan, who has suffered some election setbacks, is, I think, rather tempted to respond to popular opinion. The Ukrainian people are furious about what is being done to the Arabs in the Gaza Strip. 35,500 have already died. And I think the world was ready to accept a certain amount of reprisal from the Israelis after the settlers were attacked. There over 1,200 or so were killed. Not all of those were settlers. Many of them were military people, but there were a lot of civilians in the mix. And I think people were willing to say, okay, that was a surprise attack on them. They have a right to fight back. And so the world was generally supportive. But as time went by, reprisal has to be limited in scope to be lawful under the law of war. And the reprisal became bigger and bigger, and it involved the killing of huge numbers of women and children and elderly people. So it has angered the people of Turkey. Turkey is very important because it's one of the world's great military powers. Their army is extremely proficient. They are experienced, and if Erdogan were to turn them loose, it would probably be a situation that would involve a number of Middle Eastern powers converging on Israel. And Egypt could be drawn in, Turkey could be drawn in, other countries, perhaps Syria could be drawn in, or even Jordan. None of them want war. Egypt doesn't want war. Turkey doesn't, but the Israelis seem to be very anxious to sort of poke a sharp stick in people's eye until they trigger something that will get the United States to send ground forces and to engage in direct bombing campaigns. It is an extraordinary danger for the United States if we end up fighting all of the powers of the Middle East, and at the same time we're involved in a war with Russia and Ukraine. So it's a dicey period. Now, for the Syrians themselves, I think they look at it and they say Syria would have rebuilt. It would have had a tremendous revival. The young men of Syria don't want war. They've had war that's gone on and on and on. And whether they were on the side of Al Qaeda or of Syria, they just like to, turn their swords into plowshares and rebuild and build families and that kind of thing. The war would have easily ended were it not for the American blockade, the enormous sanctions, devaluing their currency, potentially being the ones who bombed the Beirut harbor, this tremendous bombing that wiped out the banking industry in Beirut. And so Syria is ready for peace, but they're also prepared for war. I mean, they have a powerful army. It's well equipped, and Israel has been attacking them without any declared war and without the Syrians firing back. There probably been 1,000 attacks by Israel. It's sort of like a constant terror war from the air, where they will simply go in and just like they attacked the consulate, the Iranian consulate. I think they did it in order to do the most outrageous thing that they could do to Iran, in hopes that Iran would respond and that would draw the United States directly into the war. Fortunately, this was one instance where the White House and the Pentagon did a masterful job of averting the war, and the Iranians did a very responsible job of averting the war, and Netanyahu's plan to draw the U.S. into the war failed in that particular instance.
Oh, fascinating. Okay, we could probably talk another hour, but I think this is very comprehensive. I understand you're going to speak at the International Peace Coalition meeting tomorrow morning, right?
Yes, that's correct. And I hope people will listen in, and there are going to be some tremendous speakers. And basically, the Schiller Institute is trying to mobilize public opinion to bring a greater air of caution, because it's by preempting the most aggressive and most reckless people that we have managed to ward off some of the worst excesses during this war. And if we can continue doing it successfully, then perhaps peace will come, and we can reconsider our foreign policy and some of the very grave mistakes that we've made recently.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much, Colonel Black. I always appreciate hearing from you, and especially having a chance to talk with you like this. So we will certainly get this interview widely circulated, and we'll also get the meeting tomorrow, the IPC meeting with you and others who were speaking there, widely circulated. So it certainly is time for action if we're going to avoid this disaster. And I think you have to maintain a certain optimism that the vast majority of the world is turning against the insanity of this colonial policy that still dominates the Western world. And they have another option by turning to Russia and China and the BRICS countries, which are now, expanding and demonstrating really a policy much like what America used to represent in terms of going out and developing the world rather than blowing it up. So,
well, thank you very much for having me on, and I certainly hope that we're successful in warding off any reckless ideas floating through the White House and the Pentagon, that it'd really be a good idea to ratchet up and perhaps put the nuclear bombs on the jets and on the missiles.
yeah, exactly. Okay, well, thanks very much.
Thank you.
So long.